My new ability felt like a curse. I could hear people's thoughts, but only the most depraved, fantasies of extreme violence and carnal lust. The constant noise of sin almost drove me mad. Until I started to like it. So I sought out the woman with the filthiest mind of all, believing I had finally found my soulmate. The moment he awoke to the strike of lightning in his temple, the world shattered into fragments of other people's desires. Not words, not whispers, pure, raw impulses that tore from the minds of passers-by on the street below his Brooklyn window. The first thought struck like a knife. The neighbor upstairs was imagining strangling a pillow, picturing her fingers tightening on her lover's throat until he gasped. He sat up in bed, heart hammering, while others echoed in his ears, a taxi driver on the corner fantasizing about the tear of flesh under his wheels. An old woman in Central Park saw blood on her own palms, mixed with the sweat of a memory from a youthful rage. Violence and lust, woven into a single poison, flowed like a river, and he, Daniel, 30 years of age, could not cover his ears. This was not a dream, not delirium, it lived in him now, a parasite hungry for its feed. The sensory assault was relentless, a cacophony of silent screams that painted the quiet morning air with hues of crimson and shadow, each impulse a raw nerve exposed directly to his consciousness, leaving him nowhere to hide. He tried to ignore it. In the coffee shop that morning, the waitress leaned over his latte, and a vision flared in her mind. She was pressing him against the wall, her nails digging into his skin, tearing his shirt until he cried out from a pain mixed with a shuddering thrill. Daniel flinched back, the cup slipping from his grasp. The latte spread across the table in a puddle that looked like blood. The mundane had become a minefield, every simple interaction a potential gateway to a private hell he was now an unwilling trespasser in. The scent of coffee was now forever tainted with the stench of her silent, violent want. All day he wandered through Manhattan, pressing his temples, but the thoughts stalked him. A man on the subway mentally broke an offender's jaw, leaving teeth scattered on the asphalt. A woman in an elevator saw herself on all fours, whipped with a belt until bruises bloomed, and the image made her body tremble. The shock paralyzed him. Every step was torture, every glance into someone's eyes an invasion of the abyss. The city's pulse was no longer traffic and chatter but a steady thrum of depravity that beat directly inside his skull, turning the vibrant metropolis into a gallery of horrors. By evening, he had locked himself in his apartment, but even the silence of the walls offered no sanctuary. From the next room, an echo reached him, his own father, in a memory, strangling his mother in a fit of rage, and then taking her with a force that seemed to crack her bones. This was not a stranger's fleeting impulse, this was a scar carved into the foundation of his own life, now unearthed and played back with terrifying clarity. Daniel curled up on the floor, sobbing from a nausea that rose from his soul, praying for a deafness that would never come. He tried to ignore it, to build a dam of denial against the tide of filth. The morning light that streamed through his window felt like an accusation, illuminating a world he no longer recognized. He forced himself through the motions of a life that was no longer his, showering, dressing, the scrape of a razor against his skin feeling alien and loud. Each mundane act was a prayer for normalcy, a desperate plea for the silent solitude of his own mind, a sanctuary that had been breached and defiled, leaving him exposed and raw to the psychic undercurrents of the city. He needed coffee, a ritual to ground him. The cafe was a cacophony. The barista nursed a simmering rage, imagining the espresso machine exploding, scalding the face of a rude customer. A student in the corner mentally rehearsed a brutal confrontation with their professor, words of academic debate twisting into fantasies of physical dominance. Daniel found a small table, focusing on the grain of the wood, the clink of ceramic on saucer, anything to drown out the silent screams. He ordered a latte, the warmth of the mug a fragile comfort in his trembling hands. The simple act felt like an act of defiance against the encroaching madness. Then she approached. The waitress, a young woman with a tired smile, leaned over his table to place the cup, and for a fleeting second, her professional mask slipped. In that instant, a vision exploded in his head, hers but felt as his own. She was pressing him against the grimy brick wall of the alley behind the cafe, her nails not just scraping but clawing, tearing through the fabric of his shirt to find the skin beneath. He felt the phantom sting, the heat of her breath, and heard his own imagined cry, a sound caught somewhere between agony and a terrifying, unwanted tremor of ecstasy. He recoiled as if struck. The porcelain cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. Hot latte splashed across the tiles, the dark liquid pooling like fresh blood against the white grout. The waitress jumped back, her face a mask of surprise and concern, her mind utterly, blessedly silent now, the violent fantasy gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, are you okay?" she asked, her voice a normal, human sound in the chaos of his perception. He could only stare at her, the gulf between her placid exterior and the storm within her a chasm he was falling into. He fled, leaving a $10 bill on the table for the mess. The streets of Manhattan offered no escape, only a larger, more varied menu of horrors. The city's symphony of sirens, horns, and chatter was now just a backing track to the main performance. He walked with his head down, but sight wasn't the sense that betrayed him. A businessman striding past, phone pressed to his ear, envisioned snapping the neck of a competitor with the clean, satisfying crack of a dry twig. The thought was so precise, so clinically violent, that Daniel physically flinched, a jolt of sympathetic pain shooting up his own spine. He sought refuge in the anonymity of the subway, but the compressed humanity only amplified the signal. The train car was a pressure cooker of resentment and desire. He stood clutching a pole, his knuckles white, as the mind of a man in a worn-out suit projected a scene of bloody revenge. The man's eyes were closed, and he was seeing himself cornering his landlord in a narrow hallway, his fists working on the man's jaw until teeth, like scattered pearls, littered the grimy linoleum. The imagined sounds, the wet crunch of bone and the ragged, pleading gasps, echoed in Daniel's head louder than the screech of the train's wheels. He got off at the next stop, desperate for air, and found himself in the cold, sterile lobby of an office building. He waited for the elevator, sharing the space with a woman in a perfectly tailored dress, her posture impeccable. As the doors slid shut, enclosing them in the small, mirrored box, her mind opened to him. She saw herself not in this elevator, but on the floor of a lavish bedroom, on her hands and knees. A leather belt, wielded by an unseen figure, rose and fell, leaving a lattice of blooming bruises across her back. And as he felt the ghost of each impact, he also felt her silent, shuddering wave of arousal. The shock was a physical force, a paralysis that locked his muscles and stole his breath. He stumbled out of the elevator onto a random floor, the woman giving him a strange look as the doors closed, her mind once again a placid surface. Every human interaction was now a game of Russian roulette. The smiling hot dog vendor fantasized about plunging a customer's hand into the boiling water. The young mother pushing a stroller had a fleeting, horrifying image of the wheels rolling off the curb into oncoming traffic. The darkness was not in the shadows, it was behind the eyes of everyone he met. By the time dusk began to bleed across the sky, he was a wreck. A cold sweat clung to his skin, and a relentless nausea churned in his gut. His head throbbed not with a simple ache, but with the weight of 1,000 sins he had never committed. The city he had once loved, its energy a source of life, had become a monument to the depravity of the human heart. He saw the rot beneath the surface of everything, the predatory gleam in the eyes of lovers, the violent spark in the gaze of a friend. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone in a world of monsters wearing human skin. His apartment, once a simple space, now represented the promise of a fortress. The journey home was a final gauntlet through the evening crowds, a torrent of thoughts focused on the impending night, fantasies of conquests, seductions, violations, and vengeance. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, the simple act of unlocking his door feeling like a desperate escape from a pursuing mob. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, a shield against the ceaseless storm raging outside. For a moment, there was peace. The thick walls of the old building muffled the psychic noise of the street to a dull, manageable hum. He sagged against the door, his forehead pressed against the cool wood, and breathed. The silence was a balm, a cool cloth on a fevered brow. In this quiet, he could almost believe it was a hallucination, a stress-induced psychotic break that would recede with rest. He could almost convince himself that the world was still sane, that people were still just people. He clung to that fragile hope like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. But the silence was a lie. The most venomous thoughts were not always the loudest. A new one seeped into his consciousness, not from the street below, but from somewhere closer. It was an echo, faint and distorted, like a memory dredged up from a deep, dark well. It came from the apartment next door, but it resonated with a terrifying familiarity, a frequency tuned to his own soul. It was the memory of his father. Not his father now, an old man in a nursing home, but the men from 20 years ago, his rage a tangible force in their small house. He was suddenly a child again, not in his own apartment, but in his childhood bedroom, the thin walls offering no protection. He heard the muffled sounds of an argument, the words indistinct but the emotions screamingly clear. He felt his father's fury, not as a sound, but as a pure, unfiltered broadcast of intent. The thought was a coiled snake: I will make you listen. I will make you silent. It was a wave of possessive, suffocating anger, and Daniel felt the old, childish fear twist his insides into a knot. Then came the impact. Not the sound of a slap, but the mental explosion of it in his mother's mind, a starburst of white-hot pain, shock, and the bitter taste of betrayal. He felt the phantom sting on his own cheek. He heard her thought, a silent, fractured cry of a name. And then, the thud of a body hitting the wall, the image of her slumping, the air forced from her lungs. He was seeing it, hearing it, feeling it from both sides at once, his father's roaring rage and his mother's shattering terror. And then, the horror twisted. The wave of violence did not recede, it transformed. His father's rage curdled into a brutal, possessive lust. The subsequent violation was not a fantasy from a stranger on the subway, it was a memory, his memory, now laid bare with this horrific new sense. It was the ultimate, sickening fusion of the two poisons he had been drowning in all day, violence as foreplay, lust as a weapon. He saw the act not as a child through a cracked door, but as a participant, experiencing the raw, unfiltered horror of it from inside their minds. The memory released him, and he found himself crumpled on the cold hardwood floor of his own apartment. The fortress had been breached from the inside. There was no escape. The world wasn't just filled with monsters, he was born from them. The filth wasn't just outside, it was in his blood, in the very foundation of his life. The weight of this revelation was absolute, crushing the last of his denial, the last of his hope. He was a product of the very darkness he could now perceive. He curled into a ball, pressing his palms against his ears in a useless, primal gesture to block out the world. Sobs racked his body, but they were soundless, as if his own voice was afraid to add to the noise. The tears were hot on his cheeks. He wasn't praying to a god, he was screaming into the void of his own mind, a frantic, desperate plea for one thing, for the greatest gift the universe could offer. He was begging for the return of blissful, beautiful, ignorant silence. He was begging to be made deaf again. But the shock subsided, like a poison to which the veins grow accustomed. The first 48 hours had been a descent into a private hell, a continuous, seamless bombardment that had frayed his nerves to raw, bleeding ends. He hadn't slept, couldn't eat. The taste of food was ashes in his mouth, drowned out by the psychic flavor of the cook's simmering resentments. The world seen through his eyes had lost its color, a dull, gray film covering everything as his brain reallocated all its resources to the terrible new sense, the one that showed him the world's true, vibrant, blood-colored heart. On the third day, the agony did not lessen, but his endurance grew. The constant screaming had become a new kind of silence. Driven by a desperate need to escape the echoes of his parents that haunted his apartment, he forced himself out into the city. He walked without direction, eventually finding himself on a bench in Washington Square Park. The place was a symphony of his new reality. Chess players imagined bludgeoning their opponents with the heavy wooden board, students daydreamed of violent, passionate encounters with their professors, a street musician's jaunty tune was a thin veil over a brutal fantasy of revenge. He tried to build a wall in his mind, to focus on the fountain's gentle splash, the rustle of leaves in the late afternoon breeze. He was watching the pigeons, a meaningless, neutral sight, when it happened. A young woman jogged past, her body a picture of discipline and health, her blonde ponytail bouncing in rhythm with her stride. And as she passed, her mind brushed against his, not with a whisper, but with a vivid, fully formed tableau of exquisite violence. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, detailed and passionate, leaving nothing to the imagination. She was imagining a stranger, a man she had never met, pressed against the rough bark of a tree. Her teeth, in this vision, were not for smiling but for tearing. She saw herself sinking them into the soft flesh of his neck, the coppery taste of his blood abloom on her tongue. The fantasy was not of a quick kill, but a slow, agonizing release, where his life would ebb away not in fear, but in a final, desperate plea for more of the pain she was inflicting. The thought was a bolt of lightning, pure and savagely beautiful in its construction, a perfect marriage of creation and destruction. And instead of the familiar wave of nausea and horror, something else surged through Daniel. A profound, undeniable, and terrifying wave of heat. It started low in his belly, a tight, coiling knot of warmth that spread through his limbs, making the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. His breath hitched in his throat, his heart rate accelerating not with fear, but with a dark, primal excitement. It was filthy. It was exhilarating. And for the first time since the waking nightmare began, he did not flinch away from the thought. He held it, turned it over in his mind, and let the illicit warmth of it consume him. He remained on the bench, the spell of the jogger's passing thought still vibrating within him. The wall in his mind was gone, replaced by an open door. He was no longer a victim of the broadcast, he was a listener. He tilted his head, metaphorically, and tuned in. An old man sitting on a nearby bench, seemingly dozing in the sun, was methodically, lovingly, imagining sliding a thin, serrated knife into the soft bellies of the young, beautiful people walking past. It was not an angry thought, it was contemplative, almost artistic, a connoisseur's appreciation for the contrast of red on pale skin. The pain in the old man's fantasy was secondary to the aesthetic. The pleasure was in the pattern, the slow drag of the blade, the gasp of surprise, the final, perfect bloom of blood. Daniel felt the phantom sensation of the hilt in his own hand, the imagined resistance of flesh, and the old man's deep, cold satisfaction. And again, the warmth inside him grew, stoked by the borrowed sin. It was a shared secret, a terrible intimacy with a complete stranger, and it made him feel less alone, more connected to the world than he ever had before. Then his attention was drawn to a young mother pushing a stroller, cooing at the infant within. Her surface thoughts were a gentle stream of love and maternal concern. But beneath that, in a deeper, more turbulent current, was a vision of illicit, forbidden passion. She saw herself in the arms of a man who was not her husband, an act of betrayal so profound it bordered on a form of violence against her own life. The tenderness of her fantasy was laced with rage, the imagined caresses were hard enough to leave bruises, a desperate act of self-destruction and liberation. Daniel closed his eyes, not to block out the world, but to savor it. The river of thoughts was no longer a torrent threatening to drown him, it was a current, and he was learning to swim. He let the disparate streams of violence and lust wash over him, a baptism in the collective ID of the city. The thrill was intoxicating, a drug more potent than any chemical. He felt the city's secret pulse, the frantic, hidden rhythm beneath the polite facade of civilization. The excitement was a fire spreading through the dry forest of his soul, and he was its sole, rapt witness. He rose from the bench and began to walk, but his steps had a new purpose. He was no longer wandering aimlessly, he was hunting. He moved through the streets of Greenwich Village, a divining rod for the darkest human impulses. He sought out the brightest flares, the most potent signals of depravity. A couple kissing passionately in a doorway, their public display of affection a pale shadow of the brutal scenarios of domination they were simultaneously projecting into each other's minds. Daniel lingered, basking in the heat of their shared, silent ferocity. He became a gourmand of transgression. He could distinguish the clumsy, brutish thoughts of a drunk from the refined, surgical cruelty of a sociopath. He followed a well-dressed woman through Soho, drawn by the intricate tapestry of her thoughts, in which she orchestrated the slow, psychological ruin of a business rival, a fantasy more devastating than any physical violence. Each new mind was a new flavor, a new texture in his expanding palette of sin. And each one made his own body tremble with a strange, exhilarating resonance. The sun set, and the city lights came on, but the mental landscape only grew more vivid. The darkness gave permission, and the thoughts that had been fantasies during the day now began to curdle into intent. He could feel the shift, the rising tide of appetites that the night would unleash. He walked through Times Square, a place he usually avoided, but now it was a banquet. The sheer density of minds, 1 billion watts of psychic energy, was almost overwhelming, but he no longer feared being overwhelmed. He reveled in it, a conductor standing before a demonic orchestra. He finally returned to his apartment late that night, not as a refugee seeking shelter, but as a collector returning with his treasures. He lay in the darkness of his bedroom, the city's mental hum a distant lullaby. He was sleepless, but not from terror. His mind was racing, replaying the day's acquisitions. He sifted through the fragments, the shards of other people's souls, holding them up to his inner eye. They were no longer pieces of a nightmare, they were jewels, dark and multifaceted, each one glittering with a dangerous, captivating light. The heat of these borrowed sins kept him warm. They were an echo of a desire that was beginning to awaken within him, a resonance that felt both alien and deeply familiar. He was no longer just an antenna, a passive receiver of stray signals. He was becoming a participant. The parasite had found a willing host. This was his gift now, his curse transformed. This was his secret garden, a place no one else could ever see, where the flowers were fertilized with blood and their petals were the color of the deepest, most shadowed corners of the human heart. And he was its keeper. A week bled into the next, and Daniel's new world took on a routine. By day, he was a ghost, a hollowed-out man going through the motions of a life that no longer held any meaning. He quit his job, citing a vague personal emergency, and severed ties with the few friends he had. Their thoughts, filled with mundane worries about rent and relationships, were now like static to him, a tedious noise he had no patience for. Their gentle concern was an irritation, their ignorance a source of a new, cold contempt. They were children playing in a garden, unaware of the serpents coiled beneath the flowers. But by night, he was a king ruling over a secret empire. The darkness was his domain. He became a nocturnal creature, prowling the veins of the city, drawn to the places where the membrane between civilization and savagery was at its thinnest. Dive bars, underground clubs, the shadowy corners of parks where lonely souls searched for connection or conflict, these were his new cathedrals. He was no longer just an observer, he was a connoisseur, a collector of the finest vintages of human depravity. He learned to savor the nuances, the subtle notes of desperation in a lustful thought, the bitter aftertaste of regret in a violent one. Tonight, his hunt led him to the edge of Brooklyn, to a bar that clung to the waterfront like a barnacle. The air inside was thick, a potent cocktail of stale smoke, spilled beer, and cheap perfume. And the thoughts were a storm. It was a place for endings and bad beginnings, and the psychic noise was a glorious, chaotic tempest. Daniel found a booth in the corner, a dark vantage point from which to survey his kingdom. He ordered a craft beer, the bitterness of the hops a grounding sensation on his tongue, and let the storm wash over him, immersing himself in the filth. The chaos was intoxicating, a symphony of discord. The burly bartender, wiping a glass with a dirty rag, was calmly and methodically picturing himself taking a baseball bat to the knees of a debtor. He imagined the satisfying crunch of bone, the high-pitched scream turning into a pathetic whimper. The thought was not born of anger but of a cold, businesslike pragmatism, which made it all the more chilling. Daniel felt the phantom vibrations of the impact in his own hands, the imagined weight of the bat, and a flicker of admiration for the man's clarity of purpose. Further down the bar, a drunken man in a stained suit stared at the back of a waitress. His mind was a swamp of crude, violent lust. He saw himself cornering her by the jukebox, his hand clamped over her mouth to muffle her protests. He envisioned the rip of her skirt, the scratch of her nails on his face, the eventual, brutal submission that would leave her crying in a heap on the floor. The fantasy was clumsy, pathetic in its desperation, but its raw, unvarnished ugliness was a potent note in the bar's overall symphony, a bass drum of pure, unadulterated ID. Daniel absorbed it all, a detached God listening to the prayers of the damned. He felt the desperation of a woman in the corner, whose thoughts of seducing a stranger were intertwined with fantasies of robbing him blind. He tasted the simmering jealousy of a man watching his girlfriend laugh with someone else, his mind filled with images of her bruised and weeping, begging for his forgiveness. These were his people now. The broken, the angry, the hungry. He was one of them, different only in that he could see the full, unexpurgated truth of their souls. And then he heard it. Through the cacophony of brutish thoughts and desperate desires, a new signal cut through the noise. It was sharper, clearer, a finely honed blade of a thought that silenced all the others. It was a melody of exquisite cruelty rising above the dull roar of the storm. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for the source of this captivating broadcast. And he found her. She was sitting at the bar, a silhouette against the dim lights, a glass of dark liquid in her hand. She had hair the color of a raven's wing and lips curved into a subtle, knowing smirk. He focused on her, filtering out the rest of the room, and let her mind fill his. It was not a swamp, it was a whirlwind. Her thoughts were a vortex of violence and sensuality, so intricately woven together they were indistinguishable. She was imagining a lover, his face indistinct, his body a canvas for her art. She pictured her fingernails, painted a deep, blood red, digging into the flesh of his back, carving parallel lines from his shoulders to his waist, not to cause pain, but to mark him, to claim him. She wanted him to scream, not in agony, but in a breathless ecstasy that bordered on it. The fantasy deepened, spiraling into darker territory. The scene shifted. Now there was a knife, a small, wickedly sharp blade. She saw herself drawing it slowly down his thigh, not deep enough to cause serious harm, but enough to make the blood well up, a perfect, crimson line against his skin. She imagined the way the pain would sharpen his senses, the way his pleasure would be amplified by the fear. She wanted to taste his blood, to feel the heat of it on her tongue, to mix the salt of his sweat with the iron of his life force. It was a ritual of possession, an act of worship at the altar of sensation. It was the most brutally beautiful thing Daniel had ever encountered. It was not the clumsy rage of the bartender or the pathetic lust of the drunk. It was a conscious, deliberate work of art. Her fantasy was a testament to the idea that pain could be a form of love, that cruelty could be the ultimate expression of intimacy. It was a thought that did not just acknowledge the darkness, it reveled in it, sculpted it, turned it into something sublime. It was the purest, most complete fusion of the two forces that now governed his world, the lust that devours, and the violence that caresses. A powerful current, stronger than anything he had felt before, surged through him. It was a jolt of recognition, a feeling of coming home. His body responded instantly, a wave of heat that made his skin flush and his pulse hammer in his throat. This was what he had been searching for, the ultimate expression of the new language he had learned. She was a master, an artist, and he was a humble student who had just found his teacher. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this night would not end with him alone in his apartment, sifting through the second-hand sins of others. This night would be a storm. He pushed himself out of the booth, his legs unsteady. The short walk to the bar felt like crossing a vast, windswept plain. The other thoughts in the room faded to a distant buzz, his universe narrowing to the woman at the bar. He came to a stop beside her, the air crackling with the intensity of her inner world. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and laid it gently on her arm. It was the first time he had willingly touched another person in weeks, a bridge across the chasm of his isolation. She turned her head slowly, her movement fluid and deliberate. Her eyes, a shade of dark, smoky gray, met his. They were not surprised or alarmed. They were ancient, knowing, and they held a spark of predatory light. In that instant, he felt the full force of her mind not as a broadcast, but as a direct, focused beam. It was an invitation, a challenge, and a promise. She did not need to speak. Her thoughts, which were now intertwined with his own, said everything. He saw himself in her visions, the stranger against the tree, the lover with the bleeding thigh. A slow smile spread across her face, mirroring the smirk he had seen from across the room. She stood, her body moving with a liquid grace that was both sensual and dangerous. They walked out of the bar together, leaving the storm of lesser thoughts behind them. The night air was cool on Daniel's fevered skin, but it did nothing to quench the fire she had started within him. Her hips swayed as she walked, a silent, hypnotic rhythm that pulled him along in her wake. And in his head, her visions echoed, a siren song promising a night where pleasure and pain would finally, ecstatically, become one. The journey to her apartment was a silent, feverish dream. They shared a cab, the city lights smearing across the rain-slicked windows, but Daniel saw none of it. His entire world was the woman beside him. He didn't need words. The symphony of her thoughts, a continuous, intoxicating broadcast of exquisitely crafted cruelty and passion, was all the communication he needed. He felt her anticipation as a physical thrum against his own skin, a mirror of the fire she had ignited in his veins. Every flicker of her imagination resonated within him, building a crescendo of shared, unspoken desire. They arrived at an old brick building in Williamsburg, a relic of the borough's industrial past standing defiant against the encroaching gentrification. The air in the hallway was cool and damp, carrying a strange, heavy scent. It was a cloying mix, incense and something else, something vaguely organic and metallic, like old pennies or fresh blood. The smell should have been a warning, a discordant note in the symphony of the night, but Daniel was too far under her spell to register it as anything other than exotic, another layer to the mystique that surrounded her. Her apartment was on the top floor. She unlocked the door, the click of the tumblers loud in the quiet hall, and pushed it open, gesturing for him to enter. He stepped across the threshold, and the scent was stronger in here, thick and almost suffocating. The space was sparse, minimalist, yet everything in it seemed deliberate. Heavy, dark curtains covered the windows, blocking out the city. Strange, abstract art hung on the walls, shapes that hinted at violence and anatomy. It was less a home and more a stage, a temple prepared for a ritual he was eager to begin. The door swung shut behind them, the heavy thud of old wood echoing in the room. The sound was a punctuation mark, the end of the world outside and the beginning of theirs. Daniel turned to her, his body vibrating with a need so intense it was almost painful. He reached for her, his hand finding the curve of her waist. He was ready for the final, overwhelming surge, the culmination of the mental symphony that had drawn him here. He braced himself for the torrent of visions, the promised ecstasy of claws and knives and teeth. He was ready to drown in her. But there was nothing. The moment the door latched, the broadcast ceased. It didn't fade, it was severed, as if a switch had been flipped. One moment, his mind was filled with the glorious, deafening roar of her desires, and the next, there was only silence. A silence so absolute, so profound, it was more shocking than any scream. It was a vacuum, a void where a universe had just been. Daniel froze, his hand still on her waist, his entire being thrown into a state of violent disorientation. The sudden absence of the signal was like a physical blow. He held his breath, straining his new sense, pushing it deeper, trying to find the frequency he had lost. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat in the terrifying quiet. The silence held. It was not the peaceful, empty quiet of a sleeping mind. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of a tomb. It pressed in on him, a tangible weight that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. And in that suffocating void, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was a cold that emanated from her, a deep, internal frost that seeped from the empty space where her thoughts should have been. She was still smiling, the same enigmatic smirk she'd worn at the bar, but it now seemed horribly wrong. It was a mask, a perfectly sculpted expression on something that was utterly hollow behind the eyes. She took his hand, her skin cool to the touch, and began to lead him toward a bed in the corner of the room. Her movements were graceful, fluid, but they now seemed rehearsed, the motions of a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen master. And in the cavernous silence of her mind, something stirred. It was not a thought, it was an echo. It was alien. Utterly, terrifyingly alien. It was a voice, but it had no sound, no tone, no gender. It was a pure concept, a shard of ice inserted directly into his consciousness. It was ancient, cold, and possessed an intelligence so vast and indifferent that it felt like staring into the abyss between galaxies. And it whispered, not to her, but through her, directly to him. The listener, at last. The words were not words, but a transmission of pure meaning that bypassed language. The vessel is ready. The implication was a tidal wave of ice water that extinguished the last embers of his desire. He recoiled, pulling his hand away as if he had touched a live wire. The excitement that had propelled him through the night curdled into a thick, primal horror. The room, which had seemed exotic and sensual, now felt like a slaughterhouse, the strange art on the walls like the scrawls of a madman. The incense and the metallic tang in the air now smelled unequivocally of sacrifice and blood. This was a trap. The entire night, the symphony of thoughts, the perfect resonance, it had all been a lure, a carefully crafted bait for a fish that didn't know it was swimming in a net. It was not her voice. It was not human. His mind, reeling from the shock, was suddenly flooded with thoughts again, but they were no longer hers. They were his own, twisted and amplified into a nightmare feedback loop. He saw visions of himself, not as a participant in a shared ecstasy, but as a victim. He was the one with the knife in his thigh, but there was no pleasure, only the cold, searing agony of steel parting flesh. He was the one with his back being torn to shreds, but the screams were not of passion, but of pure, unadulterated terror. He saw his own body being disassembled, an object in an act that lasted for an eternity. She moved toward him, her empty doll's eyes fixed on his. Her fingers, the ones he had imagined tracing lines of blood on a lover's back, reached out and grazed his chest. The touch was light, but it sent a shockwave of revulsion through him. He looked into her eyes and saw nothing, a complete and total absence of self. And in the chilling silence of her head, the alien voice grew stronger, its presence expanding to fill the void. It spoke again, its pronouncements like the striking of a funeral bell. The listener will fall. The vessel will be filled. The horror was so absolute it broke his paralysis. He scrambled backward, stumbling over a rug, his body desperate to create distance between himself and the thing wearing the woman's skin. He was a moth that had flown too close to a flame, only to discover that the flame was not a light, but a tear in the fabric of reality, a gateway to a cold and hungry darkness. The creature's thoughts, no, its purpose, was now clear. She, the woman, was nothing. A shell. An empty house with a single, terrible occupant, waiting for a guest who could hear its invitation. He tried to run, to turn and flee, to throw himself at the door and escape back into the familiar, human filth of the city. But his body would not obey. A strange, sickening wave of arousal washed over him, a grotesque parody of the desire he had felt earlier. It was a chemical reaction, a biological imperative that his terror could not override. It was a dead thing, a zombie of a passion, and it held him in place, his muscles locked, his feet rooted to the floor. The voice in her head was speaking directly to him now, its cold, clear thoughts weaving themselves into the fabric of his own mind. "You have heard the rapists and the gluttons," the voice communicated, a feeling of contemptuous amusement coloring its tone. "You have feasted on the scraps of their petty sins, but you have never heard the hunger. We are the ones they feed. We are the ones who wait for a vessel." Daniel fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head, as the full, horrifying truth of his situation descended upon him. His gift, his curse, was not a random mutation. It was an antenna, tuned to a specific frequency, designed to hear not just the thoughts of humanity, but the things that fed on those thoughts. Her hands were on his shoulders now, her grip surprisingly strong. He looked up into her vacant face as the voice continued its lesson, a master explaining the mechanics of the trap to its catch. She was empty, a perfect lure for one such as you. A listener, one who could hear our whisper beneath the roar of the herd. The voice laughed, a silent, chilling vibration that shook Daniel to his core. "Your ears are the key. Your body is the chalice." He was the bridge they had been waiting for, a conduit through which they could move from the realm of thought into the world of flesh. A pain unlike any he had ever known erupted behind his eyes. It was the feeling of 1,000 needles being driven into his brain, the sensation of his own consciousness being ripped apart to make room for something else. He felt his mind, his identity, his very soul, being filled, not with his own visions, but with theirs. He saw not the fleeting, pathetic sins of humanity, but an eternal, cosmic feast where stars were devoured and galaxies were torn apart in a wave of endless, ecstatic consumption. He was a drop of water being consumed by an infinite, ravenous ocean. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His body convulsed, arching under her hands as the invasion became a complete and total occupation. He was no longer Daniel. He was a container. In the last, fleeting moment before the darkness swallowed him completely, before his own consciousness was extinguished like a candle in a hurricane, the voice whispered one final, triumphant thought inside the new home it had claimed. "Welcome, listener. You are the vessel now." And outside, the city pulsed, a banquet of thoughts, but now they were not a curse, not a source of entertainment. They were his food, his chains, and an eternal, gnawing hunger that would never, ever be sated. He tried to flee, to force his limbs into a desperate, scrabbling retreat, but his body was no longer his own. The connection had been made, the circuit completed, and his nervous system was now a playground for the entity that held him in its grasp. A wave of arousal, grotesque and horrifyingly potent, washed through him again. It was a phantom tide, a neural command that bypassed all emotion, all terror. It was the desire he had chased all night, now returned as a weapon against him, a nightmare parody where lust was the mechanism of consumption, the fire that would render his soul down to ash. The voice, no longer an echo in her hollow mind but a direct presence within his own, began to speak. Its thoughts were not like human thoughts, a messy tangle of words and images, but crystalline structures of pure concept, cold and brutally efficient. "You have listened to the festering thoughts of rapists and adulterers," it communicated, the message laced with a cosmic disdain for such petty concerns. "You have warmed yourself by the fire of their fleeting, animal urges, but you have never understood the true nature of the hunger." The words were a lesson, a final, terrible revelation before the end. "We are that hunger," the voice continued, expanding its presence in his mind, crowding out the last vestiges of his own identity. The impulses you found so fascinating, the violence and the lust, they are not random sparks in the dark. They are prayers. They are offerings. They are the psychic effluence upon which we feed. He was on his knees now, her hands on his shoulders feeling less like a touch and more like the clamps of a sacrificial altar. The entity showed him flashes, glimpses into the horrifying truth of its nature. He saw it then, not as a single being, but as a vast, interconnected consciousness, a web of ancient, predatory entities existing in the spaces between thoughts. They were parasites of the soul, drawn to the raw energy of humanity's darkest desires. He saw them feeding on the psychic residue of a brutal murder, swarming like sharks at the scent of blood. He saw them clinging to the thoughts of a cheating lover, savoring the exquisite taste of betrayal. The world he had seen as a gallery of human horrors was, in fact, their carefully cultivated garden, their eternal feeding ground. The woman, he now understood, was nothing more than a puppet, a hollowed-out vessel animated by their will. Her intricate fantasies, the siren song that had drawn him to his doom, had never been her own. They were a construct, a lure woven from the most potent threads of human depravity, designed specifically to attract a listener. One like him, whose mind was a finely tuned antenna, capable of hearing their subtle whisper beneath the roar of the human herd. And now, they had found him. His unique ability had made him the perfect key, the perfect gateway. The voice in his head seemed to almost chuckle, a vibration of pure, triumphant amusement that rattled his teeth. Your ears were the lock, it communicated, the concepts now shaping themselves with a terrifying, intimate familiarity inside his skull. Your body is the door. The cosmic scale of their existence, the eons they had spent waiting and feeding, was incomprehensible, but their immediate purpose was devastatingly simple. They had been formless, ethereal, but he would give them form. He would be their anchor in the world of flesh. He would be the chalice for their endless thirst. Then the pain began. It was not a physical sensation that could be localized or understood. It was the pain of deconstruction. It was 1,000 ice-cold needles of pure information being driven into every synapse of his brain, rewriting his memories, his personality, his very being. He felt the structure of his consciousness begin to fracture, the delicate architecture of his soul crumbling under the weight of the invading presence. The self he knew as Daniel was being systematically erased, deleted line by line to make room for the new operating system. He felt his mind filling up, not with his own thoughts or even the borrowed thoughts of others, but with theirs. He was shown visions that would shatter a sane mind, glimpses of their eternal, cosmic feast. He saw not the simple tearing of flesh, but the ecstatic dismemberment of entire worlds. He witnessed the flow of blood not from a single body, but in rivers that carved canyons through dying planets. It was a universe of endless, orgasmic violence, a reality where consumption was the only form of creation and agony was the only prayer. He tried to scream, to give voice to the last, terrified fragment of himself that was being extinguished. But his throat was paralyzed, his lungs refusing to draw breath for a sound that was no longer his to make. His body arched backward, a silent, writhing testament to the agony of a soul being unmade. Her hands held him steady, her empty eyes watching the transformation with the placid indifference of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. He was a vessel, and the pouring had begun. In the final, infinitesimal moment before the darkness became absolute, before the last flicker of Daniel was snuffed out forever, the voice whispered a final, possessive thought into the conquered territory of his mind. It was a welcome and a coronation. Welcome home, listener. You are the vessel now. The transfer was complete. The door was open. And in that same instant, the world of thoughts, the one he had once observed with a detached, prurient interest, exploded into his new perception with a terrifying, vibrant clarity. The city outside, with its millions of minds, was no longer a distant storm. It was a banquet laid out before him, an endless buffet of fear, rage, lust, and despair. He could feel every single thread, every secret desire, every violent impulse, not as a sound to be heard, but as a flavor to be savored, a scent to be inhaled. The thoughts of humanity were no longer a curse to be endured or a source of dark entertainment. They were his sustenance. They were his purpose. And they were the chains that bound him to an eternal, gnawing hunger that would never, ever be sated. It was finally home.